The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. Find out more about the Charlotte Ledger and subscribe to our newsletters at thecharlotteledger.com. Today, we're taking a closer look at the transit and transportation tax referendum that's on this November's ballot. It's a $25 billion plan that would build rail and provide money for roads and buses by raising the Mecklenburg sales tax by 1 percentage point to 8.25%. The Ledger is working with our news partners at WFAE, Charlotte's NPR station, to provide thorough coverage of this issue with our weekly newsletter, Transit Time, which you can find at transittimeclt.com. And we've looked at it from all kinds of angles and have gone deeper on the different aspects of the plan, such as what exactly it would do and how much it would cost. And as part of that, we've produced 2 podcasts that are conversations about the transit and transportation plan, one with a supporter and one with an opponent. And you can listen to each one and decide for yourself how to vote on this important issue. We don't tell you how to vote. We're just giving you the information. And as you're going to hear, these aren't arguments like you'd find on cable TV. These are conversations. And my approach was to let each guest make his case and then ask some skeptical questions to prod them and push them a little bit. And I think you'll get something out of it. Today's conversation is with Shannon, a supporter of the plan. He's the founder and executive director of Sustain Charlotte, a nonprofit that promotes smart growth to improve equity, mobility, and quality of life. And again, if you want to hear the other side, the vote no side, you can check out my conversation with Robert Dawkins of Action NC in an accompanying podcast. But in this discussion, we're talking with Shannon about why he thinks the plan is a good idea. All right, Shannon, thanks for joining me.
Hey, it's great to be with you again, Tony. Thanks for having me with you.
All right, so you've been working on this issue, and Sustain Charlotte's been working on this issue for a long time about increased transportation options in the Charlotte area. And now, voters are going to be heading to the polls, early voting in October, and for the election in November. And they're going to be asked to weigh in on this referendum. And it's an interesting public policy question, right? So the question is, will people agree to vote to increase the sales tax from 7.25% to 8.25% for a plan that tax would generate about $20 billion over 30 years, fund an expansion of rail, improvements to the bus, allow money to be spent on roads and road-related projects. Like I said, you've been working on this for a long time. When people go to vote, why should they vote yes?
Well, first of all, it's important that people remember, and I think we all know this because we live here, we have incredible population growth that is not slowing down. In fact, the numbers in terms of how many people are moving here every day continue to grow, with that latest number being 157 people moving to the Charlotte region every single day. So just take a moment to visualize what that looks like. And visualize what those 157 people per day would look like if every single one of them is in their own car driving to work today, right? That's going to require a lot of road space. It's going to require a lot of parking. It's going to be a lot of emissions. And now multiply that number by 365, right? And of course, most people don't just make one vehicle trip per day. They typically take several trips a day. So the level of traffic congestion that we have already today, which anyone who drives in Charlotte knows is certainly not getting better and is actually getting worse, will just continue to worsen if we don't invest in other ways for people to get around. We've invested for really basically the history of our city, particularly the last 100 years, since cars were invented and became, affordable for most people. We've invested not just billions, but trillions of dollars in making it easy for people to drive a car. And when you're a small place, you're a rural place, that works okay because there's just not that many people and not that many cars. But the reason that urban areas like Charlotte invest in public transit and making it safe to walk and bike is because, frankly, those modes are just way more efficient and you can move a lot more people in the same amount of space, right? And we know both here and in cities like Atlanta and LA and Phoenix and really any city, any Sunbelt city in particular, that's grown mostly since cars were invented, this idea that we can widen our way out of the problem, right? That we can just widen the roads more, add more lanes, like unfortunately NCDOT is planning to do for Interstate 77. It doesn't fix the problem. It's a very temporary solution, road widening that is, that just leads to more people driving. And then those roads fill up. And pretty soon you've got a 10 or 16 lane highway that's now everybody's sitting in traffic. It's just a wider road. So now imagine those 157 people a day on a bus or a train, right? We can fit probably all of those people in 2 or 3 buses, 2 or 3 train cars. And the amount of space 2 or 3 buses or 2 or 3 train cars take versus 157 cars is dramatic. So that's why you see cities, as they urbanize, as they grow in population, invest in transit. It's just frankly the only practical way to avoid total gridlock.
Can we talk a little bit about sort of what this plan involves exactly? Because, they've been working on it for years, and I know you've been involved in that. And, it does a whole bunch of different things. So can you just sort of lay out the basics of, if this tax increase, if the referendum passes, what would we see that's different?
Yeah. So one of the exciting things about this is that there's really in it for everyone, no matter how you get around, how you want to get around in the future. If you want to continue to drive, there is money set aside to make it safer, which is important. I'd love to come back to the safety of our streets, that will make it safer and easier for you to get around in a car. There's also money to make it safer and easier to get around by bus or train. It's also, easier if you want to get around through a service like Uber, through the microtransit program that this would fund, which would allow people to get the kind of service that Uber provides within a zone, within a certain distance of their home, but not for the high cost of an Uber, but the cost of a transit pass, which is currently $2.20. So and then if you walk or bike, those the money set aside for roads would also make our streets safer for walking and biking by adding more bike lanes, sidewalks, crosswalks, and those basic amenities or basic infrastructure that is required if people want to be able to safely get to where they go outside of a car.
Right. So the money, and just for those who aren't familiar with it, it's in the legislation, it was set aside. It's okay, 20% go to bus service, 40% to rail, and 40% to roads, or like you say, road. I kind of call it road related projects, because it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to build a whole bunch more roads, we're going to extend roads. It means maybe we're going to widen some sidewalks, maybe we're going to add some traffic signals, maybe we're going to take an intersection and add a turn lane. So there's all kinds of things that fall under that. So it is sort of spelled out. So what are some pieces of the plan that you think that people have misconceptions about?
Yeah. Well, I think there's several. I think one is the one you just mentioned, the 40% of the funding that would go to roads, which works out, just so people know what the scale we're talking about is. In the first year, about $140 million is expected to be generated by this 1 cent sales tax increase for roads. So $140 million in year 1 for roads, $140 million also for rail construction, and about $70 million for bus and microtransit. So that's the breakout. And that road money, getting back to the misconceptions question, can be for all types of road improvements, as you said, right? So in some cases, there will be new roads built. In some cases, there will be some widening. But because CDOT understands what I just explained a moment ago, that widening does not solve our traffic problem. In fact, it actually increases it. They're going to do the things that make it safer and easier for people to get around, whether they're in a car, bike, or on foot, right? So I think that's one misconception. And people hear roads and they think, oh, we're just going to do the thing that got us into this mess, which is widen roads and build more roads. And the answer is, while there be some of that, the CDOT, and this isn't a secret, CDOT in the city of Charlotte adopted a plan over the last few years called the Strategic Mobility Plan that very clearly lays out their top goal is to provide safe ways for people to get around, no matter how they choose to get around. And so this funding is just going to allow them to put into practice, to implement the plans that we already have as a city. We just don't have the money to actually do. So that's one misconception, is how will that road money be used? I think another misconception or misunderstanding is just how significant that 70 million per year to invest in our bus network and microtransit is. So right now, the reason we see so many, quote, empty buses, we don't have very many riders, is because we have not invested the level of funding needed to make the bus attractive. It's as if we only built a road here and a road there, but they weren't connected, and we didn't have any parking. Like if we did those kinds of things, people probably wouldn't drive, right? And we've essentially done that with our bus network. We've barely funded it, and so CATS does not have the money to run buses that come very often, right? So right now, you have to wait a long time for a bus on most of our routes if you miss the bus. And for people who need to be somewhere, which is most people, because that's why you take the bus at a certain time, whether that be work or a medical appointment or, a hearing before a judge, you have to be there on time. And so what this money will allow CATS to do is actually increase the frequency of those buses significantly. So right now we have one route in the entire bus network that comes every 15 minutes, just one. And that's the number 9 down Central Avenue. And the national standard, what the research shows, is that for the bus to be an attractive form of transportation, one of the key ingredients is that bus needs to come every 15 or 20 minutes, because people cannot run the risk of showing up a minute late and having to wait 30, 45, or an hour, right? This plan will allow us to have 15 routes where the bus is coming every 15 minutes. And that will be on all the major corridors around the county. So all those kind of main arterials in our hub and spoke system, getting people through multiple neighborhoods, into uptown and out. So that's really important. And another important ingredient, there's essentially 4 ingredients to make transit attractive and useful. Another one is the stops themselves have to be safe and comfortable. However, because again, lack of funding in our transit system, most bus stops are what we call a stick in the mud, right? It's a metal post with a sign that says bus stop and maybe has the schedule there. What this funding will allow us to do is it will allow us to improve 2,000 of those bus stops. We have 3,000 system-wide. 2,000 of them will get a shelter. So when people are waiting for the bus and the summer sun is beating down or the rain is beating down, they can get out of the sun and out of the rain.
Got it. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the objections that some of the opponents to this referendum talk about and ask you about those. It seems like one of the main ones is the cost. And like we said, this would increase the sales tax by 1 percentage point, 7.25% to 8.25%. And the city has said that for a typical household, that would cost an additional $240 a year. It would, of course, be less than that for lower income households. Is that amount of money, is that a burden on families?
I think if we look at what families spend their funding on and what will be excluded, I don't think that it is. I mean, let's break it down to the monthly cost. So those numbers that you cited for the annual cost for the average lower income household, the estimate is that it will cost them about $11 a month. And if we think about what does $11 buy you today, right? That might buy you one Uber ride or not even a whole tank of gas. So I think we have to think about what are the costs we're paying today for transportation and how will that $11 per month investment allow low-income households to reduce their existing transportation cost. So for a lot of low-income people, right, because our transit system and other ways of getting around are so poor, they'll often buy a car because they need it to have something reliable to get to work. But if you're a low-income household, the most expensive way to travel is by owning your own car. So we're essentially forcing people who can't afford it to own a car so they can get to work, right? The average person household spends $10,000 a year to own their own car when you think about the cost of not only buying the car, but maintaining it, putting gas in it, insurance, and so forth. So we have to think about not just this is just going to be 11 more a month. We can actually help reduce costs at a much higher way, a much larger amount if people have other ways of getting around, because bus, microtransit, walking, biking, rail, all of these are much cheaper ways for people to get around. And just to put a number on that, for the average household in Mecklenburg County, not the low-income households, just the average household, people are spending upwards of 30%, 25, 30% of their income just on transportation.
All right. I'd like to ask you a little bit about one of the other objections you hear sometimes. And I hear what you're saying about if we could keep people from owning cars, that's a huge savings to them. But if you look at the way that transit is now in Charlotte and what this plan would do, it still seems like it's kind of a hub and spoke model in which you would have the rail lines all going through uptown. You would still have the transportation center uptown for the bus, and the bus routes, if you want to go somewhere, you kind of have to change in uptown. So if you live in Steel Creek, but you work at Mountain Island Lake, say, or Ballantyne, it's really hard. These crosstown routes, it doesn't seem like this solves for that issue, and that the layout of the way transit is designed in Charlotte still very much is uptown centric. Is that, and the question I guess would be, is that a modern way to kind of move people around and going through uptown?
Yeah. So a couple things on that. So first of all, that type of that's how all cities have their rail networks essentially, right? They all sort of meet fairly near the center city, and then they spread out in all directions from there. And that's what we would be doing with the rail lines that we could build with this, right? So the rail network itself and its configuration is pretty typical. Now, as far as the road network, the challenge that we have in Charlotte, which we really can't fix, frankly, we don't have a street grid. We have a street grid inside of 277, and that's about the only place in our entire county, certainly at least in Charlotte, where we have a street grid. A lot of cities, were more thoughtful about how they grew, and they built a street grid, right? Where you have lots of parallel streets, right? Every street is perpendicular to a street and parallel to a street. And you have this nice square grid. That's what you need to be able to do crosstown routes easily. But the way we designed our street network, as we grew as a city, we grew outward, but instead of adding parallel streets in all directions, we added streets at a diagonal, right? We added these diagonal streets, which were actually old farm to market roads, right? So most of Charlotte grew in that way, right? A subdivision propped down by a private landowner. They built streets for the people that live in that subdivision. And there was no consideration to how will they actually get to the neighborhoods next to them. That wasn't even a priority. So that's where microtransit though comes in. So microtransit provides these fairly large zones in many parts. I think there's going to be 19 of these across the county, where if you're traveling within your sort of in a somewhat close distance to you, but these are also pretty broad, right? If you're in Southwest Charlotte and you need to go somewhere else in Southwest Charlotte, but several miles away, you can call microtransit and have a small CATS vehicle come pick you up at your house and take you to the grocery store or some other destination, of course, within that zone. So that's one of the things CATS is rolling out to address this basic problem we have with our street grid, which doesn't allow us to just run crosstown routes because, frankly, there's no crosstown street.
Got it. One of the other things that I hear sometimes, and you probably hear this too, I get people asking me like, well, I'm looking at this plan and I see where the rail lines are going to be, the red line going up to North Mecklenburg, Silver Line, Airport to Uptown to Bojangles, Coliseum. And they say, well, I look at it and, I don't really live near any of those. What's in this transit plan for me? Why should I vote for this if they're not going to be, if I'm not going to really see any improvements close to where I live? I hear that a lot. What would you say to someone who asks that?
I mean, that's just a misconception. I mean, no, we can't run rail in everybody's backyard, right? No city runs rail through every neighborhood in their city. You have a rail network that you want to have spread out as much as possible, which if you look at our rail plan, we'll do exactly that, right? We'll have rail corridors in all directions, north, east, southwest. And then you use your bus network. The way transit systems work is you have your rail network, right, which was laid out as I mentioned, and then you feed that rail network through walkable streets, bikeable streets, and your bus network. So in any system, the majority of riders use the bus because you can run buses essentially everywhere, right? I mean, on every street, more or less. And so the bus is always the backbone. And this is why it's so important we invest in our bus network, not just rail, right? No city moves all of their people via rail. It's just impractical from a cost standpoint and from a logistics standpoint. So you have to have a strong transit system. You have to have a combination of of a very good rail system and a very good bus system. And I think here we have focused too much on rail as the solution, right? But no city focuses exclusively on rail. Where you see strong rail networks in other cities, they also have strong bus networks. So again, we can do that with this funding. We can begin to invest in our bus network in the way where it actually complements rail, right? And there's so many things we can do to make the bus more convenient, faster, safer, but it requires money.
So, I mean, they are trying to balance that out, I think. But then also, I think that there's this issue of, just because it doesn't, there's no direct benefit to you personally, it doesn't mean that you won't see benefits if we're able to take, more cars off the street, right?
That's true. But also, I think it's a misconception there is no direct benefit. So even if I'm never going to ride the bus, I'm never going to get on a train, I'm always going to drive. If that's you, the good news is that's going to be easier if we get this funding, right? And it's going to be safer. I mean, I think what we don't talk about enough in this city is what we consider a public health crisis, public safety crisis on our streets. We have on average more than one person that dies due to traffic violence in the city of Charlotte every single week. So driving in Charlotte is actually pretty dangerous. And we have far more people each week getting seriously injured in a car crash. And these crashes, although we don't talk about them much and just kind of have accepted and normalized them as a society, are not inevitable. They're a result of street design, speed over safety. And I think anybody who drives here knows that. It's a Wild West out there.
Oh yeah, you got people, running red lights, and then everyone's on their phones, and it's you got to be really careful.
We didn't design for safety, and now if we want to have safety, which I think we all do, we have to be willing to pay for that.
All right, Shannon, we're just about out of time. If you want to take 30 seconds or a minute, give us the final pitch on why people, when they're going to that voting booth, ought to vote yes.
Yeah, well, for what is a very minimal cost versus what you're already spending on transportation, which we think over time will help reduce what you're spending on transportation, while also making you safer, while also making you healthier, because we'll be anybody we can take off the road, even for one trip, that's going to reduce air pollution. And that's the air that you breathe and your children breathe. For that minimal cost, and the alternative, which I think is important, if we don't do this, things are not going to change. The only thing that's going to change is congestion will get worse because more and more people are coming. That's not going to stop.
Great. Shannon, I've enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for joining me. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was produced by Lindsay Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.